So I want to talk to you for a couple of minutes about an upcoming course, EPE 6320, Ethics and Literature and Other Related Issues. So, propaganda ban books, uh, artificial intelligence, the big thing over Chat GPT right now that's going on. So a lot of these things I want to talk about in this course. So I'm kind of pumped to talk about it with you now, just to give you a little preview of what I plan to do here. So it's a bit of a grab bag, but I think there's lots of things that could interest anyone who's got an interest in literature and philosophy and the overlap and the connections or the disconnects, whatever it may be. But look, we all have to admit that books, literature, they have a huge impact, right? Cognitively, emotionally, we often talk about how big of an impact a novel had. I loved it. I wept over it, or I laughed. It was funny, or it was moving, or sad, or whatnot. I couldn't put it down. It has a grip on us. So emotionally, literature, and I'm primarily talking about novels here, literature has a huge grip on us. But it's not just emotionally, cognitively too. Because when you think about it, as I just said, I learned something from a novel, right? I learned about the human condition, or maybe you read a historical novel and you learned something a little bit about history, and then you went and had a look at, maybe history books and check these things out. But what the historical novel can do is bring stuff alive and stimulate your interest. You learn a little bit, and then you want to get into it more deeply. And not only can they stimulate you in that sense to go study more and think more, novels can also sometimes give us a new way of seeing things, right? I read that novel about that community over there. I never thought much about it before, didn't know anything. Now I'm really getting a good idea of what they're going through, or what they've gone through and how they overcame their difficulties or whatnot. It doesn't really matter. A novel can give you a conceptual type of framework, not just teaching you things, but giving you new ways to think about things that you encounter in life. Yeah, I behave a little bit differently ever since I read such and such a novel. You read something like War and Peace, you won't see politics in quite the same way again. So novels have huge impact. Plato was aware of this, right? Plato, not so much, clearly not novels, but Plato was aware of the impact and the takeaways of fiction, right? Primarily, he was worried about poets. And he said, philosophy is in a war with poetry, right? He thought that the poets were dangerous, so you had to keep keep the lid on them, right? Maybe the poets are really like spreading propaganda. Maybe they should be on the banned list, right? Although they didn't really have banned lists in the strict sense of the term, but Plato thought poetry was dangerous and should be controlled by the state. Why? Because it is so powerful. Like other arts, like music and whatnot, you read poetry, you're exposed to it. It just affects you. It has a huge impact. So the idea of literature having an impact and a danger, that's old stuff. And it's with us today. So in this course, I want to look at a variety of things, like even what is a literary work? We'll talk about that too. Like how should we understand a literary work? So that gets us in the area of literary criticism and literary theory. That's all part of this kind of big grab bag that I want to talk about in this course. So to put some order upon all this, I've broken the course up into four parts. First part is historical. So yes, we're going to start off by looking at the classics, Plato and Aristotle. Plato's got some ideas about poetry that we can learn a lot from him, but his ideas are scattered throughout the dialogues. We'll pick up on them, read some selections from Plato, but it's really Aristotle in his Poetics that offers what is arguably the first, at least in Western philosophy, the first treatise on what could be something like literary theory, literary criticism, philosophy of literature, whatever you want to talk about, however you want to put that. But at that stage, it was all kind of together. So we'll talk a little bit about what's going on in Aristotle's Poetics. Then we'll look at some reflections. So we're going basically through some history here, skipping some, but just getting a fairly representative sample, but by no means complete. So we'll look a little bit at St. Augustine, a little bit on Dante, of course, his great poetic work, the Divine Comedy. We'll look at a bit at Aquinas as well. Jump a little bit later, we're going to look at some key figures in philosophy and political thought as well. We'll look at Edmund Burke, a little bit from David Hume and Immanuel Kant. Very important things, especially Kant, on the notion of, what is an author and a genius, and we'll look into that. Um, but then we'll look later at a bit of a romantic reaction to this, right? So we'll look at a great writer like Coleridge, and of course, one of the quintessential philosophers of the 19th century has to be Hegel. Can't get through the 19th century without talking a little bit about Hegel. We'll probably throw in a little bit of Nietzsche as well. I don't have his name up, but Nietzsche will be in here as well. And then, of course, Shelley and the great defense of poetry, a little bit about Wordsworth as well, major writer, big influence on certain forms of idealism in philosophical idealism in the 20th century. So we'll have a look at the Romantics and then finish up a little bit with a look at some of the Victorians, people like Matthew Arnold, who wasn't really, I wouldn't call him like a novelist or whatever, but was a critic. So these roles are becoming more and more separated. And of course, you can't get through the 19th century without, as I said, Hegel, but Marx, right? Sort of his student. So Hegel and Marx you have to have a look at, because Marx's views influenced so much of 20th century thought in forms of neo-Marxism, and you can't even catalog it. So it's good to have an idea of what did Marx think about literature. A little bit on Henry James, of course. He's a major novelist, American novelist that we should think about. And then a little bit of Oscar Wilde, whom I quite love and think is always has something witty and fun to say. So that's our historical bent. So that roughly, huge overview, and you're more than welcome to dive deeper into any of these. But I give you a flavor of this. And it's in the 20th century where, we start getting more theory. Although there's theoretical issues all the time, but it just starts to become a little bit more, shall we say, a little bit more diversified and split apart, shall we say. Well, in the 20th century, there's just an explosion of theories, right? They're all over the place. And there's tons of courses in English departments that deal just with theory, and they go through even a subset of them, and they take months on it. All really interesting stuff. I am by no means going to be able to do anything like that here. I'm just giving you a flavor of some 20th century theories, and I don't claim that I'm giving even a representative sample here, but just giving you an idea. And if you want to pursue others, because one of the things that I've noticed is they're not watertight. They kind of bleed into each other. The theories are not absolutely separate from each other. And it's not like the theories have real distinct boundaries, even with their authors. Some authors are in one and in another. Okay, but roughly I want to start off by looking at hermeneutics, the notion of interpretation. And it's we'll touch a little bit on Schleiermacher and a little bit on Dilthey, and then we'll look at a couple of 20th century heavyweights, namely Heidegger and Gadamer. And so some of the ideas, like the hermeneutic circle, maybe you've heard of that. We'll talk a little bit like, what is that thing? What's going on? So they're asking questions like, what's an author? What's a reader? What exactly is a text? How should we approach the text and all that? What do we even mean by a text? We'll dig into all these things. So a lot of these philosophical issues will come up as we go through these things. A very famous school, one of the formalists, there was Russian formalism, and then there was kind of an American formalism. And the American version of formalism was called New Criticism. Was sort of big in about mid-20th century and kind of faded out arguably by the 1970s. But, people will argue. No matter what I say, people are going to say, well, that's not quite right. But I want to look at just some main ideas of the New Criticism and look at a couple of articles by a fellow named Beardsley, who was a philosopher of art, but wrote some seminal articles dealing with, like, what is a reader, what's an author, what does intentionality of the author mean, and basically it's all about meaning. How do you go, right? Hermeneutics, the interpretation. How do we interpret texts? So New Criticism is kind of as I said, it's a formalism. So it kind of detaches the text, detaches the novel from its surrounding environment. And it's a fairly abstract approach, right? It's sort of, you put the novel up there and you analyze it kind of internally. I want to look at what is the reader response theory. Great article by Stanley Fish we'll look at, which is a reaction to that overly formal approach. And now he's talking about like what a reader is. So we'll check that out. Again, each of these schools has many, many more articles. I'm just picking out a couple to give you a flavor for them. Later on in the century, where there was a new historicism, Well, what does that sound like? Historical thought. That's kind of like re-embedding the text back into a historical situation. The new criticism kind of pulled it out, looked at it very abstractly, and a lot of these trends, we'll find out, follow philosophical trends as well. So philosophy, like Heidegger is, a major philosophical figure and a major figure in literary interpretation. So there's, again, bleed over not just between schools of literature, but certain or literary theory, but certainly between philosophy and literature as well. So new historicism, I want to look at some work by Foucault, kind of give you an idea, like, his idea of an author and what he thinks it is, and how does that connect with a version of history. And then last but certainly not least, a couple other schools that I want to look at briefly is a little bit on deconstruction, because that was all the rage for a while. And then a long-standing school, of course, is the school of feminism. And so each of these give you different angles of which you can use or approaches to read a given text. So not only how to approach in terms of asking more of the abstract things like what is a text, but also more concrete things like, what am I looking for? What do I have a recipe or something that I should be considering to pull the meaning out of a text? All right, so we got our historical bit. We got our 20th century bit. And of course, because this is, lots of philosophy going on, some various issues that I'm throwing in as well, right? A lot of issues in this course. One of the things that I find interesting is, well, if philosophy and literature are this, are they in some sort of relationship? And if so, can we think of fiction or literature as philosophizing, right? Normally, philosophy is written, at least certainly today, philosophy is largely written in terms of a monograph and in terms of, a straightforward, like an essay style. It might be longer than an essay, but it's really written, where an author is putting forth his or her views, and it's not really in a narrative form. There might be some anecdotes or some thought experiments in it, but the whole structure is not really a narrative. Well, when philosophy was first being written, at least by some of the more major figures like Plato, it was in dialogue form. So, and Plato is one of the few philosophers that I can think of that is not only read as a philosopher, but is also read as a literary figure. Like Plato was a great dramatist. So Plato was doing drama at the same time he was doing philosophy. So drama, is it a kind of philosophy? For instance, you might ask, was Shakespeare doing philosophy? Some people say, yes, he was propounding philosophical positions and doing philosophy in a way that you can't do outside of a narrative. So is a narrative a kind of vehicle for philosophy that plain old, for lack of a better term, plain old prose just isn't? So Nussbaum has an interesting article we'll talk about, and she's saying, yeah, there's something to it. Like, you're going to get back to this cognitive thing. You're going to get something unique out of a narrative that is philosophy that you won't get in a straightforward prose form. So we'll have a look at that. And of course, because it's philosophy, there's going to be people that disagree. So we'll check that out as well. Now, I said, propaganda and banned books. Well, literature and propaganda, what's the relationship? George Orwell basically said that all literature is propaganda, but it certainly is not the case that all propaganda is literature. What's he talking about? And so we want to look at, this relationship, again, going back to Plato, because he too thought that all literature was a kind of propaganda, right? And it had to be controlled. The state should control propaganda. And Plato got, sort of nastier as time went on about the role of literature, to the point of really wanted to ban the poets. Orwell basically says, yeah, all great literature is a kind of propaganda. That's why governments don't like it. And of course, today we are talking about changing and thinking about censoring or whatever, bowdlerizing, whatever term you want. But people are talking about changing old narratives. Like, for instance, you've probably heard that children's literature. People are talking about the Dr. Seuss estate doesn't publish certain of his children's books anymore because they've declared them, they have racist or sexist imagery in them, so those are gone. People are talking about changing Roald Dahl, another great children's author, changing his works. Mark Twain, should we change? I mean, his works are full of racist slurs, no question. What should we do about those? Should we just leave them and let people read them, or in their original, should we modify them? So what should we be doing? Because literature, again, has a big emotional and cognitive impact. Do we just, whatever goes? Should we be kind of that libertarian, or should we put controls on it? Should we censor? All kinds of interesting issues. And we'll look a little bit at the work of Jacques Ellul on the nature of propaganda. So in other words, should we be banning books, or how should we go about this? So lots of very concrete things to worry about when you're talking about the impact of literature. And speaking of the impact, last but not least, has to be the old issue of, what is an author? What is creativity? People throughout history have worried about all that. And that's really come roaring with this, you've probably heard of this, of ChatGPT, right? This sort of artificial intelligence program where you can ask it to write an essay and it will spit one out. But think about it. Does it write an essay in the way that you write an essay, the way that I write an essay? What are we talking about? Is ChatGPT like really an author? So that'll pull up some of these questions. I want to look at Bernard Williams, and it's not that he was writing, he certainly passed away before this came on, but he was talking about the human prejudice, and that we just may not care. For instance, I just put chess here. We've had, for instance, chess programs for many years now could beat grandmasters, right? I remember a few decades ago, it was always, oh, no, the best human, the grandmaster, could still beat the best chess engine around. Well, now that's not the case. Current grandmasters, they don't play chess engines anymore. They might use them for practice and get better on something, but we're not sitting around watching grandmaster after grandmaster play chess machines, and they probably all get beaten anyways, but we don't watch that anymore. And we don't sit around and watch, by and large, we don't sit around and watch chess engines play each other and, cheer one side on. We don't tend to do that. We still want to watch human beings. Is that the case also? ChatGPT, I don't care if it writes a novel, I'm not going to read it. The only way that I might read it is if I'm tricked or something. But then is that cheating or whatnot? Is there a human prejudice that in the end, like chess machines, ChatGPT might be like, well, so what? It's just cranks out a novel, but it doesn't write a novel. So we still have, as Bernard Williams would say, we still have that old human prejudice. So we'll look at a variety of issues throughout the course. So the philosophy and the literary criticism will all be kind of intertwined, and again with my general idea that these things are not really, really distinct. So what's your goal? Or your job, I should put, is to pick an area that you find of interest. Either, you might be more into history or more literary theory and philosophy, or you want to dive in on a particular thing of, something like AI and literature or whatnot. You're welcome to that. So your job will be do some research. I'll help guide you through it and write an essay on rooting your ideas in the literature and trying to put your own spin on it and be a little bit creative of your own. So there you go. Hope this is of interest, and feel free to contact me. There we go. I'm Dr. Feist. And there's my email address, rfeist@ustpaul.ca. And I'm glad and happy to talk to anybody who might be interested in the course. Thanks for watching.